Hello, am I audible to everyone?
Yes,
Hello,
ma'am.
हाँ जी. ठीक है, I'm starting the class for today because I cannot spare more time than this. I think 15 of you have joined by now. So this is the today's class will be on 4 different topics, and all of them are a separate entity in their own sense. So starting one by one with each of these. Firstly, we have intussusception, where there is invagination of part of vowel into a segment of vowel, such that, as you can see in this figure, in the colon, the cecum has invaginated, such that the outermost layer, that is colon, it is called as CPN, and the one that gets invaginated is called as intussusceptum. So these are the more common causes for the abdominal obstruction in children, especially the infants and the toddlers. And there had been the one of the most common cause, which is said to be associated as the preceding history of viral infection in these kids. So the incidence is 1 to 4 in every 2,000 infants and children. And the most predominant group is this, as you can see, this 3 years to 2 years is what they form the maximum number of children with intussusception. So 3 months, basically 3 months to 3 years is what is called as the most common presenting range for intussusception. And the seasonal variation is commonly noted with the intussusception. So what happens that once this bowel gets invaginated, their symptoms of obstruction starts. Initially, there is venous congestion, following which edema sets in, and followed by this, the compression onto the blood vessels leads to ischemic changes. Mostly, these ischemic changes are seen after 72 hours of the start of the pathology. And most common layer to get compromised first is the outermost layer of this intussusceptum. Then if it's not intervened at a particular time, then this may later leads to infarction as well as perforation of the bowel, and which, if left untreated, can lead to death of the patient. So these are various types of intussusceptions have been defined depending upon the situation. Like most commonly, they are being referred to as permanent, fixed, or like temporary or transient. So mostly these permanent or the fixed type of intussusceptions accounts for around 80% of them, and most of them are symptomatic, which requires treatment. While transient are around 20%, and they may be just incidental finding on some CT, ultrasonography, or even in the post-op period. Perioperative time. So they are usually associated with the acute gastroenteritis and mostly seen in the small bowel, and they do resolve in some time, and thus they just warrant only observation. Another important classification is by anatomical, where ileocecal is the most common site for intussusception, followed by ilio-ileocolic, appendicocolic, and cecocolic. The another important thing to note in cases of intussusception is the presence of pathological lead point. So with this, we have another type of classification, or the types of intussusception, where we divide it depending on the presence of or absence of pathological lead point. Other variants are post-operative intussusceptions as well as this recurrent intussusception. So those with the no pathological lead points, also termed as idiopathic, that they may happen on their own. So they account for around 95% of all the intussusceptions, and in that, usually what the lead point, as you can refer to as, is usually the thickened bowel wall, which is due to the inflamed lymphatic tissues or the Thayer's patches. The most common association is with either respiratory or GI infection, can be associated, have been seen to be associated mostly with the rotavirus, like rotavirus and adenovirus. Also, there had been incidents of intussusception following a Rota Shield vaccine in Europe, following which this vaccine was retrieved. Another this important classification for this is the pathological lead points, which accounts for nearly 1.5 to 12% of all, and they are mostly, they do get noticed early, that they do get noticed slightly later in the life. So as I told you, the most common presenting period is 3 months to 3 years. So if we get intussusception in the later part of, beyond that, so we should always keep a suspicion of associated any pathological lead point. And these and these are the cases where we do see recurrent type of intussusception or the multiple episodes of intussusception, and sometimes they do get resolved. And again, if you have a child who presents with intussusception in a short period of span, then you should definitely keep keep this pathological lead point in mind. So what can be these pathological lead points? It can either be focus or diffuse. In focus, as you can see, a Meckel's diverticulum, there may be polyp, there may be duplication of intestine, which are the common entities that we do encounter as pathological lead points. Another important thing that one should keep in mind is benign tumors. At times, there are adenomas, hemangiomas, carcinoids, which are present at ileocecal junction, and most commonly at ileocecal junction, not specific to that, and also in lymphomas, where they have obstruction and present and on examination or evaluation are found to be having a intussusception. So you should always keep these entities also in mind when you go and find a pathological lead point. While other multifocal causes of pathological lead points are predominantly like Hirschsprung purpura, cystic fibrosis, celiac disease, sometimes Hirschsprung enterocolitis, neutropenic colitis, Peutz-Jeghers, familial polyposis. In Peutz-Jeghers and familial polyposis, there are multiple polyps in the intestine. While in neutropenic colitis and this Hirschsprung enterocolitis, in this you do have various types of inflamed bowel, like Thayer's patches we have in small bowel. They may be the inflamed or edematous colon may be again presenting as intussusception. Now coming on to these specific types of intussusception, other specific types like post-operative and recurrent. So for post-operative, there are chances that there may be post-operative intussusception in 1% of the cases, which may present as small bowel obstruction. However, you may find no lead point associated. So they may require, they usually need get reduced by reduction enemas using hydrostatic or pneumatic enemas, and the recurrence of these post-operative intussusceptions is very rare. So once they are repositioned back, they rarely recur. While these recurrent intussusceptions can be seen after reduction following barium enema or hydrostatic enema or pneumatic enemas. So at times or even after manual operative reduction. So but however, if you they are never seen after resection and anastomosis of intussusception, where the entire vowel or the segment that is responsible for intussusception is removed. So after that, you don't find any intussusception even in the post-op period. So what happens? These children a classical triad defined for intussusception is the colicky abdominal pain, red currant jelly stool, and abdominal mass. So when a young child suddenly comes with the colicky pain, or stating that there is sudden onset pain, and which is coming in bits and pieces like every 10 to 20 minutes, to an extent that the child starts crying every 10 to 20 minutes, and in smaller kids you may find it to be associated with inconsolable crying, and child may be, as you can see in this picture, the child is sitting with the legs drawn up. It's a very classical finding for intussusception, where you will find a child sitting in the bed with its knees drawn up to its chest, and maybe crying intermittently. So, and it will be like child will be fine, running around, walking everywhere. But suddenly when the colicky pain starts, you may see that child is suddenly has changed its nature and is in pain, is crying inconsolably. So this is very important feature and is seen in almost 85% of them. The red current stool and abdominal mass are important signs, which we will say, which I will discuss just in a while. Another important feature is the vomiting, which is seen in around 20% of the cases, more commonly with the infants. Another important thing is the dance sign. As you can see, there is a visible lump or prominence on the abdominal wall, which may be seen moving across an angle or the axis. So the entire triad is present in 20 to 50% of the patients, and mostly 9% are said to have only one sign. So other associated features that you should keep in mind are dehydration, pallor, and shock, and 20% of them also are asymptomatic. Now, as I was discussing with you regarding the two classical signs, they are palpable mass and rectal bleeding. The palpable mass is classically defined as a presence of sausage-shaped mass, which is often present in the right abdomen. And the dance sign, as it says, that bowel is present in the upper abdomen, while it is totally absent in the lower abdomen. The mass, maybe if it's very large mass or coming onto the colonic part, then you may feel it in the perrectal examination. And if this mass is coming out of the body, then it's very grievous sign. So it suggests that the very big or the large length of the bowel is being a part of intussusception, and due to this, there may be the large area where the necrosis may be setting in. So another important feature is the rectal bleeding, which is usually said to be the last sign to occur when the necrosis is already set in. So a classical characteristic that is defined for intussusception rectal bleed is the red currant jelly stool. As you can see, this will be there with mixed with mucus and blood. So usually they present early, and the high reducibility rate has been seen with initial recurrences, and 95% is also there for the multiple recurrences. Perforation is very rare, so is the lead point, but it is very important. The reason for intussusception should always be kept in mind. While the complicated presentation can be with respect to the bowel obstruction, associated intestinal ischemias, perforation, then the sequelae of shock, sepsis, dehydration, and also death. So when a child has this typical presentation, and then one must investigate on the ground without wasting much of the time. So initial investigation is done with the CBC, KFT, and important thing is the abdominal X-ray is done to look for the cause of intestinal obstruction, which is a primary investigation that is done. The ultrasound is again an important investigation for intussusception, which may show target sign, donut sign, or a pseudo kidney appearance of the bowel. While this bowel enema is said to be a gold standard as it documents a real-time image of it, but only air or water soluble contrast or double contrast is being utilized these days. The barium is very rarely used, and if at all it is used, it is more so in the cases where you are sure that there is no features of perforation or risk for perforation. So bowel enema is both diagnostic as well as a therapeutic entity in terms of when it comes to intussusception. CT and MRI scannings are defined, but is only reserved for the cases where either you are dubious about the diagnosis, or you need some more confirmation, or you are suspecting other causes or associated pathological lead points. So this is an abdominal X-ray where you can see the intracolonic mass could be noted, a target sign, as you can see in this first picture. There is this target sign. As you can see, the bullseye you can visualize over here. It's trapped between the two layers of intestinal wall. Then you have this crescent sign, which is formed by the gas surrounding the invaginated bowel. Also, the gas predominantly in the right lower quadrant, left upper quadrant mostly is also and the extent in the lower abdomen may also give a suspicion of intussusception. Then target sign most commonly is defined on ultrasonogram, and however it can be also commented on both your X-ray and CT scan. CT scan is also an investigation which is, as I said, is reserved for rare cases. Then coming on to the barium enema, the classical defined feature in barium enema is that of the corkscrew or the coil ring appearance. As you can see in this image, the bowel within bowel leads to the trapping of barium between these edematous fold of bowel. Another is the meniscus sign, where which is somewhat similar to that of your this crescent sign or claw hand sign. The main contraindication for enema is, as I told before, it's perforation. Especially when you are doing the barium, you should be 100% sure that there is no associated or risk for perforation. When you have stable patients who have high suspicion of intussusception, then a radiological intervention can be attempted. However, for sick patient, you should generally go, or sick patient or where you are sure that there has been perforation, then one must resort to surgery, which can either be which is usually with the laparotomy. However, I'll be just discussing about the other surgical options. So the three main things that has to be kept in mind when you are managing a patient is that when patient presence, you have to maintain adequate NPO, replenish the body fluid, hydrate well, start IV antibiotics, and patient should be kept NPO. Then the initial when the patient is stable, and attempt for enema reduction can be given, which is usually for this we have at least these three options, that is pneumatic, hydrostatic, and barium enema. Pneumatic and hydrostatic reductions by enema do have high success rates, especially with the ileocolic intussusception. And it can be done easily for a stable child and where the radiological facilities are available. However, these are contraindicated when the symptoms have been there for very long duration or you are suspecting any perforation. While there may be a risk of perforation even during enema reduction. One must always keep anesthesia team and OT ready when going for these radiological reductions. So for operative, you can either go via laparotomy, even laparoscopy in stable cases. So in this, you just go about the intussusception, and from the distalmost part, you start slowly milking the bowel and reducing the intussusception. And then if there is any pathological lead points, that should be taken care of and should be resected and should be properly investigated by sending it to histopathology. And if there is some necrotic part of the bowel where you doubt the viability, then you should better go for resection and anastomosis of that segment. Prognosis for these children is excellent, with the mortality being less than 1% with treated cases and being 100% with the untreated complicated cases. Okay, there is some section where you can just go for observation also, especially with the transient or small segment of intussuscepted bowel. While if there is a complex entity, then you should better go for operative modality. Diagnosis and management is the key for decreasing the morbidity and mortality in cases of intussusception. Now coming on to the next entity for today's class, it's infantile hypertrophic pyloric stenosis. You can see in this image that there is hypertrophied pyloric stenosis muscle, such that it leads to the gastric outlet obstruction. This entity is one of the most common cause of gastric outlet obstruction in infants, where these are most commonly seen in the male child, and the common presentation that we say that 6 to 10 weeks of child come to our OPD who had been doing well in the initial period, then suddenly after 6 to 8 weeks the child started having projectile vomiting, and it is mostly a firstborn male child. So this is a very common presentation for a child presenting with IHPS. So it has been noted that the child whose mother had this pyloric stenosis are at greater risk for IHPS in their infancy. Various factors, both environmental and maternal risk factors, have been described as a cause for this IHPS. For the pathogenesis, it has been said the gastric peptide like substance C, gastrin being a part in the pathogenesis for IHPS. Various growth factors have also been accounted for it. Nitric oxide, which is said to be a relaxant for it, is found to be said to be absent or defective in this nitric oxide synthase deficiency found. Even the absence or lack of Cahal cell at pylorus has been found to be associated with IHPS pathogenesis. So what happens when these child present? They may have episodes of non-bilious projectile vomiting almost after every feed, and at that time there is a visible peristaltic wave noted in the abdomen, which is also called as olive, moving olive, or the moving peristalsis that can be seen in the abdomen of the child. Due to this non-bilious recurrent episodes of vomiting, they may have hypochloremic, hypokalemic, metabolic acidosis, which is very characteristic for IHPS. So due to vomiting, they lose HCl, and with the gastric juice, which leads to metabolic alkalosis. However, when the renal compensation sets in, then the sodium is conserved and the patient has paradoxical aciduria, which is very classical for this. When a child, otherwise, when a child is when anybody is having alkalosis, then there is a tendency of the body to preserve the hydrogen ion. However, in this case, we do have paradoxical aciduria, which is very classical feature for IHPS, as with along with hypokalemia. So, also one classical thing about this kid is that parents do say that whenever the child, he again starts crying for feed. That child is, it's said to be that the child is always hungry. So when you have such a child, the important thing that you have to look at arterial blood gas, as I just mentioned, the important metabolic derangements that are associated with IHPS. Also, ultrasonography should be considered as it also forms the diagnostic criteria. The LAID criteria states that a muscle thickness of more than 3.5 to 4 as per the various studies, pyloric channel length more than 16 mm, pyloric diameter of more than 14 mm are highly suggestive for IHPS. Contrast studies not done these days. Ultrasound is good enough to give us a concrete diagnosis. So contrast study is reserved for rare cases, or if it is being done at other centers, they may have a classical signs like caterpillar sign or the mushroom sign at the pylorus. Then the beaking could be there, and the track sign could be there. Also, a shouldering is also this shouldering, as you see in this one. A shouldering is noted due to this will be the hypertrophied area of pylorus from stomach to duodenum. Then the initial fluid resuscitation remains a very important feature when it comes to IHPS. These children should be metabolically stabilized. Aggressive fluid management is needed for highly deranged chloride, bicarb, or potassium. So once these children are resuscitated, then we should take them for surgery. The common procedure that has been described is Ramstead pyloromyotomy, where the pylorus serosa and muscle is divided and is spread, making sure that we don't go beyond it and damage mucosa. So once you start dividing the muscles, the mucosa starts pouting from the incision wound site, where you know that a sufficient incision has been made. This Ramstead pyloromyotomy can be done by laparotomy, which can be small with the small incision it can be right upper quadrant or circumumbilical as per the surgeon's choice. And the procedure can also be done with the laparoscopic pyloromyotomy. Important thing is there is specially designed instrument for splaying these muscles called as Benson's muscle spreader. So for complication, if incision is overdone, they may have perforation. Also in the post-op period, frequent vomiting may persist beyond 3 to 4 days, which can be attributed to incomplete myotomy or unsuspected perforation. So these things should be kept in mind. Otherwise, these children have excellent prognosis. Once this is done, the child can be started on feed within 6 to 24 hours in the immediate post-op period, and the child is fit for discharge even by less than 2 days post-operatively. So now another entity is the patent vitellointestinal duct. So this vitellointestinal duct is a connection between the yolk sac and junction of midgut and hindgut of growing embryo. So also known as omphallomesenteric duct, which usually obliterates by 5th to 9th month intrauterine life. However, the anomalies of vitreointestinal duct are seen in 2% of the cases, with equal prevalence in both boys and girls. However, symptoms are seen to be more with the boy. So as you can see in this diagram, if the entire tract is present, then it is called as the patent vitreointestinal duct. However, if only the intestinal part remains, or there is a diverticular formation, then it could be responsible for mucus diverticulum. A small cyst could just be a remnant, then enterocele. The entire tract may be degenerated and is just replaced by, or is just remaining remnant with the fibrous band. So a vessel could also be remnant. Then onto the abdominal wall part or the umbilicus part, a cyst may be remaining, which can present as umbilicus cyst, or there may be granuloma as a fleshy lesion on umbilicus, or umbilicus polyp. So these are the remnants of vitreointestinal duct which presents beyond infancy. However, we will restrict our discussion mostly to the patent vitreointestinal duct. But I would just like to make a comment about mucus diverticulum. It is the most common of all the vitreointestinal duct anomalies, with the common 2% rule. When it is said, it has the incidence of 2%, present in children usually within 2 years of age, and is present within 2 feet from the ileocecal junction, and is of length commonly is of 2-inch length. So and usually have a two mucosas, that is there may be a heterotrophic mucosa present. So just a word about mucus diverticulum. It's an important entity that one should know. So coming back to our topic, that is patent vitreointestinal duct. So when this duct persists and remain patent, then we call it as the entity. It may be asymptomatic, or there may be discharge, which can be umbilicus discharge from it. The parents may bring a child and say that there is a watery discharge coming from the umbilicus, or a foul smelling discharge, or even small parts of the feces are seen near the umbilicus. So, and very, very rarely you can see that they may have other associated, or may have a complication due to obstruction, where due to the presence of this vitreointestinal tract, there may be associated volvulus intussusception or adhesion. Treatment is simple, that is surgical, where a wedge resection or a segmental resection should be done. Segmental resection is usually favored in these cases because there is a risk of heterotrophic mucosa which may be remain in the tract, as is for the mucus diverticulum. So, however, both these entities both these procedures can be done as per the surgeon's choice, that is wedge resection or segmental resection. And however, if there is any complicated case, or if there is any prolapse or intussusception, then one must immediately take the child for surgery, where it becomes an emergency, not urgency or planned thing. So usually they again have good prognosis, and except for the omphalitis, where there may be sequelae leading to excoriation, scarring at the umbilicus. Now coming on to the last topic for today, which is not just a small topic, and it's a big topic. I have just tried to highlight only the main on the named entities. So is my slide visible again? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So now coming on to this last topic. This is vascular anomalies or the hemangiomas. So when we discuss about these vascular lesions, more say, they have been described in various classification and differently. The important thing is to note that a word, that is vascular anomaly, it comprises of two different entities, that is vascular tumors and vascular malformation. So I think for you guys this classification is good enough. However, we have a very complex or detailed classification. Um, so I will not go into that detail and just giving you a brief about this. You just view this classification, where again it has been described in two different uh, plots like vascular tumor and vascular malformation, which is again subdivided in both the sides. So I will not go in detail to tell you this, but yes, coming back to the basics that you should keep in mind, that is vascular tumor and vascular malformation are two different entities and they are a part of vascular anomalies. So depending upon their different embryogenesis or embryopathology and their histopathology, these are different entities. So when we have to discuss about hemangiomas, they come or they form as a part of vascular tumor. While when we discuss about different malformation, then we have lymphatic, capillary, venous or arteriovenous vascular malformation. So in the benign vascular tumor, what we will be concentrating on is the infantile hemangiomas and the congenital hemangiomas. And again in the just brief about like lymphatic malformation is again described in a very big and detailed classification. However, we'll be keeping it simple to like what you should know. It's like common lymphangiomas, common lymphatic malformation or the generalized lymphatic malformation, and in common macrocystic, microcystic, and mixed cystic. So this firstly we'll start with, I just made one slide for each entity. Uh, so I'll just explain this to you. The infantile hemangiomas, these are the commonest tumor that we see, and they are most frequently on the cervicofacial location. As you can see in this child, they are usually absent during the birth. However, the parents specifically say that within first week of life, they noted a reddish swelling which is gradually progressive and is enlarging with the time. However, it has to be noted that it follows a very specific course where there will be a proliferative phase, then there will be a this your involuting phase. So they are being staged like this only. Then at when the child presents to us, we have to make sure that which stage the child is in, and have to counsel the parents also that this has a bell-shaped curve like course, where initially it will progress and then subsequently it will regress. So they can be again focal, multifocal, segmental, intermediate, and they again can be superficial, deep, or mixed depending upon their location. They are usually associated with other vascular malformations like commonly with the faces and the lumbar. So this is just acronym for the various syndromes associated with it. The second entity is your congenital hemangioma, which are less common than your infantile tumor, but yet they are a very known and described entity. They usually present and are there at the time of birth and are found to be regressing over 1 year of life. And if not, they can be seen as they may remain static or may later involute. But there is hardly any what we'll say progressing phase in congenital hemangioma like that of infantile hemangioma. So they are usually static or they will start decreasing or involuting. So based on this, the three different type of hemangiomas, congenital hemangiomas are described like rapidly involuting, non-involuting, or partially involuting hemangiomas. They again have their own features and they may be analogous with various other entities. So another now coming on to the vascular anomalies. So of this, the common anomaly we see is the capillary malformation, which usually affect your skin and mucosa. And a common word that is being used for them are like port wine stain, salmon patches, angel kiss, or stroke bite. This is a common thing that you will find people may be utilizing these words to define them. However, one should be clear that these are capillary malformations which are present at birth and usually persistent throughout the life, with a very small part of them being lightening with the age and rarely disappearing. The another important anomaly is your lymphatic, sorry, not, I will not say anomaly, it's like vascular malformation is your that of lymphatic malformation. As I had shown you that there's an entire list of sub-description for lymphatic malformation, but more important that you should keep in mind is that it's microcystic, macrocystic, and mixed. This helps us define the management. The macrocystic lymphatic malformations, for them what we can utilize is the sclerotherapy is very easy for them, where we can aspirate and decompress these macrocysts and then can instill the sclerogent. So they are mostly seen in the cervicofacial region, as you can see in this child, and the skin over them is usually normal colored. And until there had been some sequelae, some injury, or some intralesion hemorrhage, they usually are of the skin color or with the skin texture. So they can be localized or they may be generalized, where they may be multifocal or may have chylous effusion, like they may present with the pericardial effusions or pleural effusions or peritoneal or cytic fluids. So these are due to the primary dysgenesis of lymphatic networks. Now, another type of vascular malformation is that of the venous malformation, where where they have a specific skin color discoloration as well, as because they are usually superficial and or they lie within the subcutaneous part. So they may be present even on the skin, they may be there in tissues, they may be there noted in the specific viscera. The important finding or the examination finding is that they are compressible. The vascular malformation are specifically described as the soft compressible swellings, and they have the tendency to increase when there is a raise in the venous pressure. So the associated complication with them may be thrombosis, due to which there may be pain or there may be a hardened swelling. So they again can be focal, multifocal, or diffuse. The another malformation, this is your arteriovenous, which is said to be the most aggressive type of malformation. The most common finding for them is their pulsation at the time of palpation. Also, you can hear a bruit when you auscultate them. These are usually very enlarging. On examination, they may be red, warm, and may have pain. So these these lesions have the tendency for ulceration and bleeding as well. And if they are very large, then there is a risk for cardiac overload, or you can say high flow cardiac output in these patients. So I am not, there are numerous named anomalies or entities when it comes to vascular malformation. I've just kept it to two, which are more common, like Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome and blue rubber grab Nevus syndrome. So these are usually a combination entities, where you can see, like in KT syndrome, there is capillary lymphatic as well as venous malformation associated, and it's they have a classical triad of atypical varicosis, nevus, and limb overgrowth. Similarly, in this another entity, blue rubber blab nevus syndrome, you have these small lesions in your skin, in your GIT, so and various other organs. Now, coming on to the very last part, that is the management of these vascular anomalies. So initially with the vascular malformation, the venous malformations, you usually rarely you go for surgical excision. Surgical excision is usually reserved for the cases where you have a disfiguring entity. Otherwise, they are usually managed with compression or anti-inflammatory medications, with some intervention being with that of the sclerotherapy or laser ablation. While the surgical excision is again, as I told, reserved for the cases where you have disfiguring entity. Then lymphatic malformation, they are again treated medically or with sclerotherapy. Sclerotherapy is forms the large bulk when you discuss with various treating teams. The sclerotherapy is what commonly done for the lymphatic malformation, where OK432 or the bleomycin can be instilled in the lymphatic malformation to desiccate its wall and decrease its size. And while the surgery is again reserved for just to preserve some anatomical structure. Then arteriovenous malformation. These are high flow vascular malformation. One cannot just go and excise them easily. So mostly they don't resolve with medical management or sclerotherapy. So one has to plan for a percutaneous embolization, where the embolization is done onto the main feeding vessel, which in these cases. And again, the surgical option is reserved mainly to control that the main feeding vessels to AV malformation. The infantile hemangiomas, most of them resolve with the time, as I told you before, that they have bell-shaped like curve or have a initially progressive and then involuting course. So intervention is only reserved for the cases where they are fast growing or they are near some functional organ and are causing their functional problems, or they have complications like that of the hemorrhage, infection or ulceration or high cardiac output. So in those cases, surgical trimming can be done or laser ablative could be done. However, for the large lesions, you can go for pharmacotherapy, but they may not give you the immediate effect. But it has been seen that they do effect over certain period of time. The most commonly used drugs are propanol and corticosteroid, which is being used in various clinics. And then again, cryotherapy and laser therapy remains an option. So this is just an overview where you can go for various options depending upon the situation. And the congenital hemangioma, they for the rapidly involuting, you just need to observe. While if the surgical reconstruction is reserved for the residual skin lesion cases. And for non-involuting, yes, you have to intervene. You may have to work, especially if they are disfiguring or they are symptomatic. So you can go for surgical excision for the thicker lesion or using laser for superficial lesions. So that's it. So we are able to conclude our talk within time. I hope you understood something at least. Hello, are you anybody is listening or not?
Yes.
So, okay, chalo, this was today's class. If you have any question, you can let me know. And all the best for your exams.